Welcome to the Compliance Council on Command webinar series. Today's topic is prompt payment crediting and payoff statements. This is really the third part of 3 truth in lending servicing rules that were released in January of 2014. Periodic statements, arm adjustment notices would be the first 2, and then this is in 1026.36 of Regulation Z and discusses how to credit partial payments, addresses late fee pyramiding, and requires certain timing and requirements when you get a payoff statement request. This is 1026.36 is kind of a mess. There's a lot of regulations dumped into that one section, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So that's a section that also has loan originator compensation provisions as well as these new servicing regs. So if you're looking for a regulation under the new regs and you can't find it in there, chances are it's in 1026.36, so go out there and take a look there. Coverage of the rules we'll talk about today are closed-end consumer loans secured by a principal dwelling. So that's key because principal dwelling is going to eliminate a solid subset of loans that are subject to many other Regulation Z regulations. It's going to eliminate any second homes. Only talking about consumer loans secured by a principal dwelling. Other than that, there aren't any exemptions from this rule. A lot of the other January mortgage rules have a laundry list of specific exemptions, construction loans, reverse mortgages, etc. No other exemptions here except for that principal dwelling. So prompt payment crediting. This isn't anything wholly new in the regulations. The regulations already required on a mortgage loan that when you, the bank, received a payment, you credit it promptly. What the new regulation adds is a more specific definition of payment. So now it's defined as periodic payment, and it's an amount sufficient to cover principal, interest, and as applicable, escrow for a given billing cycle. Once you receive a periodic payment, you have to credit that payment. You have to credit that periodic payment regardless of whether or not it covers late fees or any other fee or charge that isn't accounted for in principal, interest, and escrow. For example, if I have a $1,000 mortgage payment and that covers my principal, interest, and escrow, if I have a $50 late fee outstanding on my account, when I make a $1,000 payment the subsequent month, my statement may say amount due $1,050. So it's a $1,000 payment plus the $50 late fee. Well, when I make a $1,000 payment, that payment has to be credited in full. That's a payment of principal, interest, and escrow for that billing cycle. To take it a step further, and there's some disagreement about this, I haven't still really received a clear response from the CFPB, but my interpretation of this regulation is that you can't take the late fee out on top of principal, interest, and escrow either. So when I make that $1,000 payment, you can't pull $50 out of it first. If you pull that $50 late fee out first, now you're only crediting $950 towards principal, interest, and escrow, even if you're not treating that as delinquent. So even if you pull the $50 late fee out first, credit the $950, but don't otherwise treat that payment as delinquent or late in any way, the borrower's still not getting the benefit of that $50 going towards principal, interest, and escrow. So there still is some small incremental harm to the borrower. And that harm is arguably caused by the failure to not credit the full payment of principal, interest, and escrow when it was received. So that can be a problem, kind of a backdoor way of getting into a possible prompt payment crediting problem is if you pull that late fee out first. This also applies to partial payments. So there's specific language in the regulation about how partial payments are handled if you utilize suspense or unapplied funds accounts. Nothing in the regulation dictates what you do with a partial payment outside of that scenario. If you receive a partial payment, at your option, you can credit the payment in full, you can reject the payment and have a policy that says we won't accept partial payments at all, we'll only accept payments for the full amount due for that billing cycle, or you can retain that payment in a suspense or unapplied funds account. You can still do any of those. But if you retain it in a suspense or unapplied funds account, you have to, one, disclose the amount of funds that are held in that account on the mortgage periodic statement if you're required to provide a periodic statement. So that's where we get into that small servicer definition. If you're a small servicer, you service 5,000 or fewer mortgage loans, you're not required to provide a periodic statement. So that disclosure of the amount held in a suspense account isn't going to apply to you. If you're not a small servicer, however, and are required to provide a periodic statement, then you need to disclose on that statement any amounts held in a suspense or unapplied funds account. Second thing you need to do, and this applies regardless of whether you're a small servicer or not, when you receive enough funds in that suspense account to cover a full periodic payment, you have to credit that payment out. So that's common sense to a lot of community banks. What it means is if I make a $500 payment, my payment again is $1,000 for principal, interest, and escrow. I'm going through some financial straits. All I can afford is $500. So I make a $500 payment. You retain that in a suspense account. Next month, I make another $500 payment. Now there's $1,000 in that suspense account, and you have to credit that out as a payment. I'm still $1,000 short, right? There are 2 months of payments, $2,000 of payments total, and I've only made $1,000 of it. So I'm still delinquent. But once you get enough to cover that, you have to sweep it out of that suspense account. And the purpose of that is the dirty trick that some larger servicers or non-bank servicers were pulling was they would, maybe I go along that route for 6 months. So I pay $500 for 6 months. So I'm short every single month, but I have $3,000 in there. Well, some larger banks would not sweep that out. And so I would have made 0 payments, according to them, because they've just retained all of that in a suspense account. That's not an option anymore. It has to get swept out of that suspense account. Pyramiding late fees was already prohibited under FTC regulations. Now it's written into Regulation Z. What pyramiding is, and the prohibition of pyramiding means, is you can't charge a late fee that's solely attributable to the borrower's failure to pay a previous late fee. So take that example I gave previously. $1,000 payment, I have a $50 late fee. If I make $1,000, if I pay, so I essentially have $1,050 due. If I make a $1,000 payment, I still have that $50 late fee due. It's still out there. But you can't charge me another late fee simply because I failed to pay that $50 late fee. Now, if I make a $500 payment, now it's another delinquency charge. You can charge another late fee, and now I have $100 of late fees. But then in the third month, if I pay $1,000 and haven't paid the $100 late fees, you can't charge me a third late fee. It can't be solely attributable to the failure to pay a previous late fee. Lastly, payoff statements. This is very simple. So previous to January rules, you were required to provide a payoff statement within a reasonable time after any request of the borrower. Now they've just narrowed the rule down again a bit and made it more clear. So the final rule effective in January clarifies that reasonable time generally means 7 days or less. It generally can't exceed 7 days unless the loan is in bankruptcy or if there's some act of God or other disaster that would cause it to extend beyond the 7 days. In the commentary, it adds a bit more detail than that and says, generally, reasonable time is within 5 days. So if you're providing that payoff statement within 5 days, you're presumed to be paying it off within a reasonable time, but in no event can it exceed 7 days. So there may be instances where that extra day is necessary, but it can never exceed that 7 days except in exigent circumstances. Second, the rule requires the request to be in writing. So previously, the rule required you to respond to oral requests. Now the rule is narrowed where you only are required to respond to payoff statement requests when they're received in writing. So this reasonable time period response is only triggered when you receive a payoff statement in writing. Now that doesn't mean that you can't still take payoff statements orally. You can still take a verbal payoff statement request and respond. This just means that you're not required to under the rule until it's in writing. So a lot of community banks, high customer service, want to be responsive, ask, well, what do we do? We want to continue to respond to oral payoff statement requests. What do we do? And my general advice is, if at all possible, still comply with the timing in this regulation. So I would still ensure that you're getting it out within 5 days, no later than 7 days, if at all possible. Now, the rule isn't technically triggered, but I think is a best practice, and it may even simplify procedures. If you choose to respond to oral requests, document it. Document the date of the request so that you can show that you're complying. But just best practice, I would still provide it in this time period. And for the most part, I haven't heard a lot of banks having issues with getting these out within that 5 days or no later than 7 days. So that's the third of the truth in lending servicing rules. Again, periodic statements, the ARM statements, and these payoff statement and crediting rules that are in 1026.36 intermingled with some of the loan originator compensation rules. Thank you.